It's funny how we get used to the smallest routines, isn't it? For Eric, it was his elderly neighbor. Every morning, at exactly 7 a.m., she'd appear at her window across the street, wearing a warm smile and giving him a gentle wave. Eric wasn't one to interact much, but her presence was comforting, a reminder of life moving in its quiet, predictable way. But one morning, everything changed. Eric woke up late that day. He hurried past his window but stopped, almost out of habit, to glance across the street. Her window was dark, no curtain pulled aside, no sign of her familiar wave. He thought, maybe she's just sleeping in. But as the hours passed and the light faded from the sky, that window stayed dark. He decided he'd check on her. After all, she was elderly, living alone. Maybe she needed help. That afternoon, Eric crossed the street and knocked on her door. The paint was peeling, the air around the house oddly cold for a sunny day. No one answered. He peered into the window, but all he could see were thick, dusty curtains. Eric decided to ask the landlord about her. Maybe she was out of town, staying with family. He found him the next day, a gruff older man working in the building's basement. When Eric asked about the neighbor, the landlord froze. His face went pale, and he shook his head. "That apartment," the landlord said, almost in a whisper. "No one's lived there in over 5 years, not since Mrs. Callahan passed." Eric felt the ground shift beneath him. He stammered, No, that's not possible. I see her every morning. She waves to me from the window." The landlord gave him a grim look. "Son, that's impossible. The place has been boarded up since she died. No one's been inside." Eric's skin prickled. He had no explanation, but he couldn't shake the image of her smiling and waving. He decided to prove it to himself. That evening, he climbed the creaky staircase to her apartment door. The air grew heavier with each step, a chill seeping into his bones. When he reached the door, it was locked tight, but something felt off. The doorknob was ice cold. He leaned closer, pressing his ear to the door. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping sound, slow and deliberate, like fingernails drumming against wood. Against his better judgment, Eric pushed harder against the door, calling out, "Mrs. Callahan, are you in there?" The tapping stopped. Then from deep inside the apartment, a whisper, "Eric." His heart raced. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Eric, come in." Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was dark, the air suffocating. The furniture lay under dusty sheets. Cobwebs draped the corners, and behind the curtain at the window stood a small, frail shadow, waving. Eric froze, unable to move. The figure behind the curtain turned slowly, and as it stepped into the faint light from the hallway, his blood ran cold. It was Mrs. Callahan, but her face was wrong. Her hollow eyes were sunken and dark, her smile stretched unnaturally wide, and her skin hung from her bones like it had been there for decades. She raised a hand and whispered, "Why did you stop waving, Eric?" Terrified, he bolted, stumbling down the stairs and out of the building. He didn't stop running until he was safely back in his apartment, locking every door and window behind him. But as he caught his breath and looked out the window, he saw her, across the street, at the window, waving. The next morning, Eric's window remained shut. But those who walked by his house swore they saw a figure standing there, waving, smiling faintly, with hollow, sunken eyes.